welcome back to Definitely Not Definitive. I'm Ken.
And I'm Bethany.
And we're just a couple destined to be in love that love some Destiny. So we're checking out Destiny, the complete journey of Destiny, but we're not gonna do the whole video. So we're just doing the Book of Sorrows up until Destiny 1. So we did our own Destiny 1 journey where we checked out all the cutscenes for Destiny 1 and the DLCs for that as well. And we're gonna go into Destiny 2, but we wanted to get some more lore from My Name is Bife. And so we're gonna check that. We checked that channel out before. We did some Warframe for that, and now we're gonna do Destiny because I heard he's a Destiny lore daddy.
Ooh,
yeah,
quite a name.
So we're gonna do these in parts as well. So we film these videos like in different chunks, like 4 different chunks for this long video. So over a 2-hour video. For longer videos like this, we're gonna do it in chunks, and we release it early on Patreon, so you can check it out as we go along. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So this first part is the Book of Sorrows.
Okay.
Or the Books of Sorrow. There's multiple.
The ancient history of Destiny starts not with humanity and not with Earth.
With books.
The records from this time supposedly date back millions of years with a record of histories and ceremony kept by the Hive, known only as the Books of Sorrow. The veracity of these accounts is sometimes thrown into question, with one of the Hive gods even scrawling in its pages that they are full of lies. But as it stands, these books represent our only record of a series of times from millions to potentially hundreds of millions of years ago that would otherwise be lost and unrecognizable to us. And so, with nothing else to tell us any better, and armed with the knowledge that these records may be imperfect, we must start with the records made in the Books of Sorrow, not at Earth, but on a distant shadowed world called Fundament. Fundament was a gas giant, one so massive that its gravity could pull other planets down beneath its clouds, where they would impact on its surface oceans. The remains of these planets would form into continents, and on these continents, life of a sort would struggle to carve out an existence. The smallest form of life on Fundament was that of the Krill, and they were constantly under threat from the harsh world upon which they lived. There were many nations of Krill, and one such nation was the Osmium Court, and their king, its ruler, was about to be put through dire straits. Their king was 10, a long and withering existence for the short-lived Krill, save for their mother spawn who lived significantly longer. The king of the court had 3 offspring. Shiro, the youngest, who aspired to the ways of combat so she might seek adventure and defend her people. Sathona, the wisest, one who wished to consume the royal jelly and become a long-lived mother so that she could learn all of the secrets of the world. And Aurash, the eldest. She who was to become the next ruler of the Osmium Court. She who was to take the King Morph and to replace her aging father. Though they could not possibly know it, these 3 siblings would change the universe forever, and would be led down a path of destruction so great that it would shake the foundations of reality itself. But this all began with their father's assassination. Their father was senile at the time. Most Krill who were long-lived would die at the age of 8, but at 10 years old the king was being driven to madness. But to some, it was evident that there was at least some method in his madness. He would study the sky, raving of moons above Fundament's eternal storm clouds, and always he was accompanied by his familiar, a white worm-like thing that was dead but had washed up from the sea depths. In a state of despondence and in response to the king's consistent madness, Teox, a mother of the Osmium Court, wrote to their arch-enemies, the Helium Drinkers, begging for them to kill the king of the Osmium Court and to slay his 3 offspring. offering to rule as a regent for them beneath their command in his stead. The helium drinkers happily accepted and slew the Osmium king, but they were not fast enough to slay his progeny. Shiro, Sathona, and Ulrash fled with their father's familiar and took a ship out onto the great oceans of Fundament. Upon its mast, they swore in blood that in their lifetimes they would return to the Osmium court and avenge their father, kill Teox and the helium drinkers, and understand the doom that their father spoke of as he raved in what many believed to be madness, but the sisters were slowly starting to realize might well be something to be concerned of. The doom that their father spoke of was later divined by Ulrash, who remembered the last words that her father had said to her, namely, that the moons were different and that the laws were bent. He made a sign representing a syzygy, and it was this that revealed to Ulrash the nature of their doom. In the skies above Fundament, there were 52 moons in orbit. But if all of them fell into the correct alignment, they would pull in the same direction all at once, and they would therefore pull the vast waters of Fundament's oceans into a massive bulge beneath where they lay. When the combined force of their gravitational pull passed, the mass of water would then be dispersed in all directions in the form of a tidal wave that would swallow whole civilizations. Wow. A god wave. Their quest was now even more urgent. Shiro, Sathona, and Ulrash needed to not only defeat the traitors, but to save their world and their people from extinction. In their extended travels, they found a great crashed ship, an artifact of a bygone era, an artifact of a greater civilization. This was not necessarily a seafaring ship, it was potentially a spacefaring one. It was the Needle, and they had only found it thanks to the whispering of their father's worm, which was now held by Sathona. The dead familiar that the king had always brought with him was apparently able to communicate with her, and with its advice, they held onto the Needle instead of selling it. They then took a further 2 years not only to repair the ship's systems, but also to deeply understand them. But as 2 years passed, Sathona grew worried. She believed that they would not have the time they needed to see the dream of their vengeance realized. It is then that Ulrash stated that they should dive. They had long since learned that they could use the ship to chart the immeasurable depths of Fundament's oceans, and Ulrash believed that below the waves, closer to the planet's core, they might find answers. Shiro protested, remembering the bodies of the ship's prior owners and how something from down in the deeps had clearly caused their ruin. But Savathun, who had heard the worm familiar whisper to her of the plan's brilliance, agreed with Ulrash. And so, the descent began.
Why are you listening to that worm?
Through crushing depths and past terrifying beasts, the siblings ventured until they came to a still place. Here, they monitored the waves above, and the sensors of the ship stated that their fears of a syzygy were indeed true. It was indeed coming to pass, and it was at that moment that they encountered the Leviathan, a creature as massive as the continents of their childhood. And it spoke to them, urging them to turn away from the depths of Fundament and from the deep itself. The Leviathan's voice was booming inside their heads, massive, forceful, and determined at first. But when finally it was exhausted by the protests of Ulrash and Shiro, Sathona would state that they should dive. Her justification was completely clear at this point. She stated that she was guided by her father's familiar, and that this was what had given them hope, whilst the Leviathan merely wished for them to return to the surface of Fundament to live short lives and die. And so they continued to dive deeper, down into the crushing depths of Fundament's core. And down in those depths, Aurash found herself standing unprotected on the hull of the ship. But in spite of the immense pressure and heat, she was unharmed. Before her, there were 5 massive creatures. They were the worm gods. Yul, the honest worm, Zol, the will of thousands, the ever-hunger, Ayr, the keeper of order, and Akka, the worm of secrets. Ancient creatures that served the deep, or as we now know it, the darkness. Yul offered Aurash and her sisters a bargain, and told them that the worm gods had been trapped in Fundament's core for eons by the Leviathan. Their bargain was simple. They would be granted immortal life by consuming the children of the worm gods, but they had to always obey their nature as beings. Shiro would be perpetually attempting to test her strength, Sathona her cunning, and Aurash her knowledge of the universe and her explorations of it. The sisters accepted the bargain and took the worm god's larvae back to the surface once they had all chosen new morphs and new names. Shiro, Sathona, and Aurash ceased to be, and with that, the birth of the ascendant hive gods Shivu-Arath, Savathun, and Aurix was complete, with Shivu-Arath taking up the night morph, Savathun taking up the mother morph, and Aurix the king morph. They rose again to the surface of Fundament, feeding the worm god's children to any krill that would follow them, and killing the rest. The war they brought to the surface eventually engulfed all of Fundament, with the survivors falling back to Kahan Atoll. The worm gods eventually rose to the surface with them, and escaped Fundament with the forces of the sisters. They pursued Teox, the sterile mother who had betrayed the Osmium dynasty to one of Fundament's icy moons. On that moon, the worm gods discovered that there was another race inhabiting it, known as the Ammonite, and that there was also a 53rd moon hanging above its orbit. Although technically this was not a moon at all. It was a divine presence of the deep's polar opposite. It was a presence of the sky, or the light as we better know it. And what was this presence? The Traveler. The Krill and the Worm Gods undertook a campaign of annihilation against the Ammonite, Teox and the Traveler, and whilst Teox would escape during the campaign, the siblings of the Osmium dynasty, especially Ulrix, learned of the ways of the sword logic and embraced a dark power, making them even more terrifying and giving Teox good reason to flee. During the war, though, Ulrix was struck with ideals of pacifism, which enraged the Worm Gods. They believed in the ideals of the sword logic, that life should be tested against life, that only the strong should remain. The worm that Ulrix had consumed in the depths of Fundament yearned for war, and eventually, this hunger was starting to gnaw at his soul, and led him back into the fray. But even after this, he still offered to parley with the Ammonite on neutral ground. It was then that the Worm Gods demanded Savathun teach him. And teach him she did. She betrayed Ulrix. She killed him. But Ulrix did not die. Instead, he awoke in his throne world, a part of the Ascendant Realms, an alternate dimension where the Hive Ascendants go when they die. It is only in this Ascendant Realm that he could truly be killed. And whilst Ulrix was recovering, Savathun went to the neutral ground and poisoned it, killing the representatives of the Ammonite that were meant to meet at the point to parley for peace. Before the war was won, the Leviathan came forth from the depths of Fundament and was slain by the forces of the deep in a final battle of Fundament's moons that shook the worlds to their core. After burrowing out of the worlds they'd conquered and multiplying at a great pace, the Krill would take up a new name as a species and would be referred to from this moment until time ended as the Hive. They strengthened their resolve and battled each other for over 20,000 years, and then, at last, they set out stronger, and they set out on a campaign of genocide across the universe, fighting many different species and bringing all of them to their end, finding them unworthy of the Sword Logic's challenge, the test that states life should exist with strength. However, they encountered a problem, as Ulrichs discovered that the more they fought, the more the hunger of their worms expanded. And so, they faced the threat that they would not be able to satisfy their worms' insatiable hunger. This put the supposed immortality that the worm gods had offered them into context. But beyond just this, it set the stage for a greater threat that was looming on the horizon. An alien empire known as the Ecumene came to face the power of the siblings. They had diverted all their resources into a campaign of utter annihilation against the Hive, responding with overwhelming force whenever Ulrichs, Savathun, or Xivu-Arath appeared. They knew exactly how to defeat the Hive. And this was no coincidence, because they were being guided in that method of destruction by Teox, the traitor mother. Eventually, the siblings were beaten back so much that they were left with no strength to go on fighting. They gathered in Ulrich's throne world and assessed their options. Whilst Xivu-Arath wanted to retreat and gather strength, and Savathun wanted to beg the worm gods for more power, at this point, Ulrichs knew the logic of the sword better than them both, and knew that they needed to aggressively proclaim their right to exist through war and death. As this truth was affirmed, a plan of action was devised. In this plan, Ulrichs slew his two sisters, and by the sword logic, became more powerful by proving his might over them. With their true deaths under his wing, Ulrichs went to Akka, the worm god of secrets, and told him that he wished to receive the secrets of the deep. When Akka said he gave no secrets, Ulrichs rebuffed the worm god and stated that giving was for the sky and that he had to take what he wanted, even if it meant killing Akka, even though Akka was his god. And so Oryx slew Akka, the worm god, and from his ruin he pulled the secret of communing with the deep. He recorded that secret on a series of tablets, known as the Tablets of Ruin, and hung them about his waist. Following this, he used the secret to enter the deep itself, and whilst his speech with the deep was not recorded, what is known as this: when he emerged from the deep, he pronounced that he was Ulrichs no longer. Instead, he was Oryx, the Taken King, and that he had the power to take life and make it his own. It was at this moment that Ulrichs went out into the universe and unleashed his new powers upon the Ecumene forces, namely his new ability to take, which allowed him to abduct his enemies, corrupt them with darkness, and return them as compliant slaves bound to his will, and given new abilities thanks to the power of the sword logic. It was too much for the Ecumene, and eventually they were pushed back and slaughtered. It is here that Oryx enacted two peculiar Hive resurrections. In spite of their deaths being true, both Xivu-Arath and Savathun were returned to life, each of them respectively summoned back with war and trickery. The Ecumene were eradicated so completely after this that only in the Books of Sorrow and in the mind of Teox, who yet again had evaded their capture, were they even remembered. All note of them, all memory, all trace was wiped from the universe. Following this, Oryx would have moments and time to commune with the darkness, thanks to the rituals recorded on the Tablets of Ruin, and the darkness would show him terrible dreamlike hallucinations, replicating his childhood and teaching him to be yet more brutal, to embrace the sword logic even further. Oryx also learned that Xivu-Arath and Savathun were at this moment conspiring to leave him stranded on his expedition into the deep. Despite this, he was brought back. and when he was brought back, he endeavored to bring sons and daughters into this world so that he might love and kill them, so that all would be empowered and strengthened. The first of these children was Crota, the Eater of Hope, whose strength was unparalleled and who would one day rise to be one of the greatest champions of the Hive. The second was Nokris, who was feeble in strength but strong in mind. More of a wizard than a knight, unlike his demon brother. The third and fourth of his children came from a single larvae, cleft in two by Oryx's great sword Willbreaker. The larvae became the twin daughters of Oryx, the death singers Uranuk, the Weaver, and Ur-Halak, the Unraveler. Oryx's children accomplished many great deeds, and their stories were numerous. From the creation of the Death Song to the destruction of whole axioms of the universe, Oryx's daughters, in particular, were highly accomplished. One day, they were cutting a wound in reality, and were proceeding to die inside it. When Oryx inquired as to why, they stated that they would seek to create an oversoul as a way of both hiding their deaths as well as creating a death impulse capable of defending their throne worlds if needs be. Oryx told Crota that he should observe his sisters and try to learn cunning from them. And so, Crota too decided that he should experiment with a wound in reality. However, when Crota tore open a wound in reality, it was thanks to Savathun, who had manipulated the wound, that a partially mechanical form of life poured forth from it, a race known as the Vex. The exact origins of the Vex and the nature of their power is shrouded in a fair deal of mystery, but they spilled forth from the breach and began to invade Oryx's throne world. Before Crota could respond by destroying them all, a Vex mind manifested known as Coria Blade Transform, which deduced the sword logic. With this knowledge of the particular universe in which they stood at their hand, the Vex began to slaughter Oryx's thrall and acolyte, and by right of conquest and slaughter, had gained a foothold and presence within Oryx's throne world, as they invaded it with force, obeying the logic of the new space that they had found. In spite of Uranuk and Ur-Halak pulling sword stars from the sky and creating devices known as the Annihilator Totems to stop them, the Vex would press forth unabated. It was only as Coria abducted the children of the worm gods and discovered that by praising them it could gain even more power that the worm god Aya stepped in, telling Oryx to set his house in order. Oryx returned home and slew the Vex invaders, pushing them and Coria back. As punishment, he took Crota and threw him into the Vex Gate network, saying, "Come home glorious, or die forgotten." Crota would accomplish this, going on to be a legendary demon of the Hive, tearing down his opponents and allowing only a few to survive to tell of the wrath of the Osmium dynasty. But even though Crota had succeeded, there was still a problem, because Oryx's throne world was now left with a tear inside it, a tear that left him weak to a counterattack, or potentially sabotage by one of his sisters. And so, before his court he declared that they would transform his throne world, his part of the Ascendant Plane, into a physical ship in the material world. This was the Dreadnought, and it was built not only from parts of Akka's corpse, but with the incredibly terrifying, mind-bending power of Oryx and his Hive. His court worked in tandem to create what was effectively a paradox. A throne world of the Ascendant Plane pushed into physical space, a screaming, gaping hole in what would be reality. But regardless, Oryx's power was so incredible that even breaking the laws of physics themselves was nothing towards his might. With this accomplished, Oryx's throne world was secure. And now was time to deal with Coria. He used his dreadnought to attack a flotilla of ships that was guiding the Nightshare Thought ship, a great vessel that he believed contained the location of a place of immense light, known as the Gift Mast. When he boarded the ship, he found Coria and squarely defeated it, even as Coria tried to simulate him and his power. Coria was taken, and Oryx presented its remains to Savathun with but a single change from the typical beings of the Taken, namely, that it had a small fragment of its independence still left, and it was not completely bound to the will of its controller. From here, the Hive took their time and prepared to make an assault on the Gift Mast, which they had now found. The civilization surrounding this great place of light had been passed over by the Traveler, which had altered the gravity of a black hole so that the worlds around it might not be devoured and would instead flourish within its now altered accretion disk. They would be provided warmth and sustenance, and their civilization would grow. And as a monument to the light, the Traveler erected a gift mast, a great spear-like structure that jutted from the black hole and was filled with the power of the light. A gleaming monument rising forth from a singularity, filled with the energies of life itself. The Hive wished to devour this light, and as the Deep was moving in this direction to devour the whole system, so too would the Hive naturally be its vanguard. They marched upon the Wishmast, killing the Harmony, its occupants, and the Ahamkara, the great dragons that lived among them. But as the Gift Mask was being devoured by Oryx's brood, and as his victory was certain, Savathun departed her brother, saying that they needed to grow distant from each other. She took her moons and her brood, and they fell into the black hole that the Harmony lived around, never to be heard from again. In the same stroke, Shiva Wrath took her broods and war moons and fled into the night with a similar purpose. Both of their throne worlds became distant and inaccessible to Oryx, and he was left to ponder. It was here that Oryx reaffirmed his choices and his belief in the darkness, but Oryx also pondered the question of what should happen if he should die. He surmised that the one who killed him should be the one who understood the universe in a more complete manner than him, and he believed that he would only be killed by something mighty, something that had some greater knowledge of the sword logic, perhaps, or perhaps with some clever trap. He therefore decided to lay out a means by which he might survive, even if he was destroyed. Within the Books of Sorrow, he created a map to a weapon that exemplified everything that he was, that in a certain way was him if created. And a being that wielded this weapon and used it to become mightier than both of them would be Oryx living on, and Oryx deduced that they would become one and the same. A means by which he could truly become immortal, even beyond a true death. This weapon would not see construction for generations, but when it was, it would be a weapon of malice, and we would be the ones to construct it. But the tale of the Osmium dynasty would not be simply left there. Oryx's second son, Nokris, who was born as a lesser being of wisdom as opposed to strength, wished for more power, and knew that his strength was in that of his mind. He went to the worms, his god, to Yul, to Zol, to Aya, and Ur, and he petitioned them, asking them for knowledge of the origin of all things. All the worm gods denied him, except one, Zol, the will of thousands, who was lesser than his brethren, and saw that in time he would be prey for his peer Yul. He gave a portion of his power to the young Hive Prince, and taught him the art of bringing forth life from death, necromancy.
Nice.
But the power Nokris held had been given and not taken, and this infuriated Oryx, who saw his son's actions for what they were, heretical to the very ideals of the sword logic, and a betrayal of his own dynasty. he cast out his son and removed all record of him from every hive archive. The only record of Nokris that remained was a single statue before the altar of Oryx, which stood defiant in its permanence. These are some of the earliest tales of the universe of Destiny, tales that predate even our own history. But as many of you will realize, they are but a small part of a grander cosmic war. A war between formless and form, between the deep and the sky, between the dark and the light. The Traveler, the divine presence of the sky, would continue onwards, evading the hive and the darkness, seeking out the call of worlds with the potential to receive its light, for those with meaning in their roar. And thus the Traveler would make its way to the Elixni, but they would suffer much the same fate as the Harmony and the Ammonite and the Ecumene, and they would suffer at the hands of the darkness and the Hive. Their entire system was destroyed in an event remembered only to the Elixni as the Whirlwind, where they were left to make a great exodus and abandon their home, following whatever trace of the Traveler they could. The Great Machine, as they would come to call it, would however find a new place to set its roots. As the Elixni transformed their once noble society into a more barbaric and tribal one, the Traveler had begun to take root above a system and a planet far, far away. The name of the planet was Mars. The name of the system was Sol. And the year in the human Gregorian calendar was that of 2014. And in this year, it found us.
All right, so it was cool learning the origin about like, the Taken King.
Yeah.
And some other like of the hive that we fought. We didn't fight, but that you fight in Destiny and like Crota, and so it was nice getting the story. I mean, we almost just started with this one before we went into our Destiny journey, but I think that like starting with Destiny 1 and getting into it a little bit more,
yeah,
like was a nice foundation kind of for this, and then now learning more about like the explorations that we saw.
So I mean, I always love a good lore video,
yeah,
and so it was wonderful to dive back into the history of this world. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really interesting that age-old trick of seeking power and like, sure, of course, but in exchange for.
Yep.
And it's something that seems harmless, but then it winds up being that thing that completely took over them. And I found it interesting that it was in sort of like the king, the queen, and the knight was sort of mm-hmm. like how they seemed to evolve once they ate the little worm larvae thing.
Yeah.
So they kind of had these sort of preconceived roles that they would fall into based on what the larvae wanted them to do and like how they were going to serve the hive. I thought the worm gods of the deep were really interesting. I kind of want to even learn more about them and like the different things they represented and how they came to be. Like we got this for the krill and like the three sisters. But I kind of want something similar for like the worms themselves. Like, why are there worm gods in this kind of world? Like, how did this start? And it probably feels fast to the people who are involved, but it was sort of like this slow evolution of events that kind of led to this hive taking over and this downfall for these people. And yeah, the Taken King history now I get now why he is the Taken King.
And so, two main takeaways is one, never trust a worm. So, if a worm starts talking to you, just don't trust what they have to say. It's knew right away when the worm says, "Oh no, build this ship," and then like go down there. We definitely should go down there and do this. Like no, and that's because like their worm daddies were down there. Two, always trust a Leviathan. Leviathan was trying to help, was keeping the worm gods, down below where they belonged, and then also that what is it we said before? That saying that's the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yep.
Started off where they wanted to get, revenge for their father being slain. They wanted to save the planet and save their race and save the world
from intentions.
Great devastation. And then all of a sudden they were just like, oh, you know what? Screw all that. We can be immortal. All right, yeah, cool. Yeah. And if you don't want to be, serve us and be immortal along with us, and you don't want to eat worms, then screw you. You're dead. We don't care about you anymore. The tidal wave was going to kill you anyways, so who cares? Life is all about who you surround yourself with. And if you surround yourself with people that are cutthroat and power hungry, and you think that like, you know, you all are all in it together, like you're never going to be all in it together. All right. So don't surround yourself with those kind of people, because they're always going to betray you. So obviously, if it was the way of the sword, or sword logic, which I like the way they said it, sword logic.
Yeah.
I like that phrase. I like that saying. You know, surrounding people with people that follow sword logic, then yeah, eventually they're gonna have to kill you to become the most powerful.
You bring up a really good point in that. Like if you're surrounding yourself with people who are out for themselves, at the end of the day, you have to remember that they are out for themselves.
Yeah.
Which means they're not there for you. I also couldn't help but think of like, you know, with the visual of the story with like the worm whispering into the ear of the king and stuff.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think of Wormtongue from Lord of the Rings.
Ooh,
as he's
yeah.
whispering into the ear of the king of Rohan. And I was like, this is not going to be good. Like throughout history, I've never heard of a worm whispering into the ear of the king ever being associated with anything that has a positive outcome.
That is very true. See, do not listen to worms, people.
Or anybody named Worm.
Yeah.
Or Wormtongue. Like,
yeah, exactly.
There's a theme here that's just not good.
Yep, for sure. This also made it seem how like formidable the Taken King was, and like how impressive it is to take him down.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
But that he's gonna live on. He's gonna live on through a weapon, and like ultimately, kind of like with Sauron and his ring, or the Lich King, and like, you know, Frostmourne and like the armor and everything like that, where like, you know, this evil being like has a way through immortality through an object. You know, Voldemort and his Horcruxes.
Yep.
So that sort of seems to be, you know, a reoccurring theme throughout, you know, a bunch of different great pieces of literature.
It's funny, this idea of immortality being that thing that always leads people to their own inner destruction.
Yep.
None of us want to die. Like it's not like that thing we're really excited about having happen, but you know, it's the fact that life will end that makes it worth celebrating every day. Because, you know, if you were immortal and you could just live for forever, then what makes today special? But knowing that like you only have so many days on this planet, that's a motivating factor to go out and like make it worthwhile.
If you're watching with us on Patreon, then we're gonna continue with this. And so we're gonna check out some more stuff next week. And if you're watching on YouTube, then here we go, the next part.
In that year of 2014, humanity witnessed an unknown artifact entering the orbit of the atmosphere of our closest neighboring planet of Mars. It was clear for all to see. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe. This strange object was of immediate concern to the powers of Earth, and 15 months later, with cooperation, planning, and commitment, humanity sent its response. The combined powers of the People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, and United States of America led to the creation of the most famous space voyage known in human history, the voyage that would come to be known as Ares 1. And so it was that one taikonaut, one cosmonaut, and one astronaut, Chow, Mielova, and Hardy, all set out on a journey that would change history. Mars, of course, is a planet with little to no atmosphere, and yet, when the Ares 1 craft touched down, it did so in the middle of a storm, the breath of God as the wind buffeted them back and forth before landing. This was not some strange coincidence. This was the work of the artifact. And as they took their gear and trekked across the Martian surface, they could start to see the artifact come into view over the horizon. As they crested the ridge ahead of them, they saw it completely for the first time. It was at this moment that the first Martian rains began to pour, and the actions of the object were made clear. It was terraforming Mars. And something else became clear as well. This alien presence was not some conqueror or some terrible invader, but was instead benevolent. They called it the Traveler, and its arrival in Seoul would change humanity forever. This would be known as the start of our Golden Age, The Traveler's divine presence would be a boon to our system, and under the radiance of its light, Sol, Earth, and humanity would blossom. The planets and moons of the system were terraformed, with worlds like Mars and Venus becoming habitable planets with diverse ecosystems of life and repositories of resources. The moon became the way station for all of the system, sending resources from Earth to far-off colonies on the methane oceans of Titan or the garden world of Mercury. But perhaps the most profound change of them all was the people of Earth themselves. Human lifespans tripled, and the fundamental ethos of our society changed and evolved. Not only were we more intelligent and longer lived as a species, but we also put that knowledge to use instead of squandering it. We cured a myriad of diseases that had haunted us, put study into any number of emerging scientific and philosophical fields, and we extinguished the old hatreds of mankind's past forever. Humanity created vast monuments throughout the solar system as the Traveler worked to seed it for us. From the great Martian city of Freehold to the new Pacifica arcology of Titan, from the solar research stations of Mercury to the Ishtar Academy on Venus. Humanity began to flourish in every place imaginable in the system. Beyond merely the places we laid claim to, there were the remarkable accomplishments we attained in this time, with the great minds of the Clovis Bray Corporation and others like them leading the way and bringing forth some of humanity's greatest inventions. The rise of one of these was most notorious and important of all, the war mind, Rasputin. A supercomputer tasked with the mandate of defending humanity from extrasolar threats or skyshock alerts. Rasputin was an intelligence of such immense might that it was capable of predicting and calculating threats before having even encountered them, and of devising a solution to them so that they might never threaten humanity, even if they did enter the system.
It was like its own Minority
Rasputin
Report.
was armed with a vast defensive array of weapons and doomsday devices that could scorch black the skies of 1,000 worlds in the name of humanity's defense, should the need arise. But this wasn't the only great invention of Clovis Bray. They also created many incredible technologies, such as the intelligent nanotechnology known as SIVA, which could be commanded to construct anything imaginable. This made it a particularly valuable technology to those colonists who were heading outward to the stars, as it could be spontaneously used to create anything from a prefabricated shelter to an oxygen rebreather, if given the correct direction.
Sweet.
Furthermore, when relic iron, a mysterious new material, was studied on Mars, the Clovis Bray Corporation discovered an entirely new state of matter, where data was completely free from the restraints of physical matter. This state was known as engram, and it allowed any idea imaginable to be stored. And of course, there were the Exos, a project of Clovis Bray that allowed humans to transplant their consciousness into a mechanical body and live on past the point of normal human life expectancies. However, there are hints in the programming and the past lives of Exos still alive today that give us an idea that they may have been more violent in nature. The Exos dream of a place where they were born, the Deep Stone Crypt, and whilst some of them go there and walk peacefully through a field of golden millet, most of them dream of almost endless battle to reach the tower where they were born. But this is not to say that Clovis Bray was not the only one researching remarkable technologies for humanity, or making incredible discoveries throughout the system. The researchers of the Ishtar Academy on Venus at this time discovered the ruins of an ancient civilization on Venus that predated humanity by billions of years. These were the Vex, and the ruins they discovered were those of the Vault of Glass and the Infinite Steps. The Ishtar Academy and the Ishtar Collective would make it their responsibility to study the Vex and their constructs at any place possible. As our golden age magnified our glory, humanity's greatness shone like a beacon in the night, illuminating the very stars themselves, and convincing us that our destiny was not to remain on Earth like our ancestors, or to continue their petty wars, but instead was to reach forwards and upwards to the stars, and to grasp the very majesty and grandeur of the universe itself. We flew out into those stars and spread our wings. Alas, that we let our hubris get the better of us. Not all were so ill-prepared or foolish, though. Whilst most sat in complacency beneath the glorious bounty of the traveller, some, such as the 3 families of the Black Armory, would begin crafting phase technology and weapons so that they might fight back or defend themselves. A noble effort. But tragically, it would not be even close to enough to stop what would come next. As the centuries of the Golden Age passed, the Warmind began to detect something far beyond the reaches of the system. Something dark and terrible. Something that spelled our doom. Rasputin's responsibility was to defend humanity, and to this end, the Exodus program was created, a colonization effort that involved thousands upon thousands of souls, all being loaded onto colony ships and sent outward to the stars. But in spite of this titanic effort by Rasputin and his subminds, such as Malahayati, in spite of the valiant efforts of General Chen Lanshu, in spite of everything that humanity would attempt to accomplish before the end, it would not be enough. As the vessels of the Exodus program began to reach further out towards the edges of the solar system, something terrible and dark swept them back in the other direction. The Warmind raised its mighty weapons that were strong enough to shatter the might of stars, and responded to this threat with the full fury of its arsenal. But alas,
Wasn't enough.
even this was not enough. The darkness had found our system, and in doing so, had found the Traveler. Doom was upon us. The Golden Age was ending. The
Quickly.
collapse had begun.
Golden Age didn't seem to last very long.
The dark tide that was upon our system brought with it a terrible doom that could not be defeated by the Warmind and its defenses. But the foe Rasputin faced was not by any measure one that could be considered normal. The darkness, much like the Traveler, defied simple causality and defied even the basic rules and logics of the universe. Physics, mathematics, they meant nothing before this entity.
Shit.
It could not be defeated with the weapons of the Warmind alone, and it was made clear from this moment that our annihilation was inevitable. The vessels further out in the bounds of our system were crushed by the darkness as they attempted to reach beyond the asteroid belt. These ships would eventually form a mass of broken debris within the belt itself, and this place, this terrifying graveyard of all that humanity had hoped to see, this would come to be known as the Reef. And this would be a fate much like many of those on Earth and its colonies would suffer. They would be crushed beneath the wheel of the shadow of darkness as it passed ever onwards through the howling void of the universe, killing indiscriminately in the name of its twisted logic that life should be able to fight and meet strength with strength. But the darkness's fury was not yet sated. The darkness had another target in mind. It was also here for the Traveler. The details and accounts from this time are limited and unclear, but there are several accounts worth referring to when speaking of the darkness during the collapse. The account from Cade Six's journals speak of a terrible miasma that spread across the many worlds of the system, holding every human it could find in its grasp and drowning them in a tide of doom and despair. Cade seemed to point towards the darkness having a malicious consciousness. As it was drowning its victims, the victims were allowed to be fully conscious. They were aware, they were lucid, and yet even as agony and pain washed over them, the darkness wished them to witness the destruction of their world. It wished them to know they had been beaten, outmatched, and utterly destroyed, that they were unworthy of existence, that they were prey, nothing more. The Black Armory Papers, a series of journal entries kept by the founder, Henrietta Meran, detailed another encounter with the darkness. Their group had been locked within one of the fortified facilities of the Black Armory, and had to hold back terrible, indescribable creatures that broke through their defenses. They smelled only like wet earth, and made sounds akin to the screeching of machinery. One thing that is made clear by every entry is that the foe that had taken Earth was a terrible one that would see us all destroyed if something was not done. At this time in the system, others were starting to stake their claims too. It was in these moments that another terrible pair of interlopers arrived. Nokris and Zol, the Will of Thousands, took it upon themselves to claim the planet of Mars and to rain down an assault on Hellas Basin, where Rasputin's main control center was kept. However, in a successful attempt to hold off the forces of the Hive Prince and the Worm God, Rasputin used its power to flash freeze the entire region, locking the Worm God, the Prince, and their Hive servants away under a thick sheet of ice.
Smart.
In turn, Rasputin too would also experience a period of dormancy. We would hear nothing from Rasputin's true centralized network for centuries, as only fragments of him remained within the various Warmind bunkers that were still active across Earth and its many territories. What happened next is an event clouded in mystery and uncertainty. Some spread rumors that the Traveler was in the process of fleeing the system, as it had done so many times before. Others spread rumors that Rasputin might have engaged the Traveler as it attempted to flee in order to prevent this outcome. And some merely believed that the Traveler was attempting to find the right spot to stand and fight against the menace that had embroiled itself throughout our system.
Yep, one final stand.
Whatever the truth might be, the Traveler moved from its previous resting place on Io and found its way to Earth. Here it would make a titanic stand against its enemy, the Darkness. The battle was long and would shake the heavens and the earth, a battle of proportions that the universe perhaps had never seen before, of the titanic forces of the cosmos, of a yin and a yang, smashing against each other, breaking upon each other like waves on rock, with enough force to level a mountain and raise it again within the blink of an eye. The two fought, the two stood. The two tested themselves.
They need each other, though.
And what's more, the Traveler won. It was crippled and broken, but it sacrificed itself to save us and to push back the darkness. But its sacrifice was not without some form of hope. With the Traveler's dying breath, it created the Ghosts. Small, autonomous drones filled with the power of its light. These ghosts would serve the forces of humanity and would seek out those amongst the worthy dead who might possibly provide hope to humanity and its defenders. These would be the few chosen champions that could wield the Traveler's light as a weapon. In the earliest days that followed the collapse, these beings were known as the Risen, and whilst they would come later to be known as Warlords or Iron Lords or simply Lightbearers, today they are known by a simpler name: the Guardians. With the terrible events of the final clash ended and the ghosts released into our system, the events that would make up the collapse would come to a close. But there was one far stranger account from the collapse that was given. An account from one of the Exodus program vessels that hit the asteroid belt just as the darkness was approaching in earnest. This vessel, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, would become the crucible of the forces of light and dark, and would become the birthplace of an entirely new species of beings. It is here, in these most calamitous of moments, that the people known as the Awoken were born.
There she is, the queen. Her little pissant brother.
What follows next is another account that is shrouded in mystery.
A lot of mystery in this.
Of how a new kind of being was brought into our world. One of both the light and the dark, of the deep and the sky. They were known as the Awoken. Their history is recorded in a series of documents, but the most notorious of these is known as the Mara Sena, which talks of the rise of their entire civilization and how they came to join humanity in the struggle that had consumed them. It speaks of a great rift not only at the center of the Awoken soul, but also, in time, within the Awoken people. A people that would be riven by circumstance, choice, and their leaders. The Mara Sena also comes with a warning, namely that in our attempts to grasp its truth, we may in fact mistakenly learn to believe a lie. It is therefore once again at this point that I should state that the story of the Awoken's creation is told through a single source, and that the truth of the matter may yet elude us. But with that said, yet again it is our only source of context, and so, as best we know it, this is the history of the Awoken people. Aboard one of the Exodus program vessels, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, the captain, Alice Lee, detected a strange signal that was following them for approximately 18 hours in radio silence. After repeatedly ignored hails, and just as Captain Lee cut the engines so that she might make a sharp about turn and face their ghostly stalker, a message was received from the Warmind Rasputin. Rasputin had detected a hostile extrasolar intruder in the system and had initiated a Kahe-White emergency, bringing all of the potential weapons in the system under his control. Rasputin demanded control of the Exodus Green and its onboard guns. But as Captain Alice Lee decided what to do next, torn between her colonial mission and her duty to Earth, darkness swarmed around the hull of the ship, and through its veil, even the light could not be seen. Terrible gravity waves shook the ship as they simultaneously compressed and expanded every molecule of the crew and their vessel. After the vote from the crew came in to continue onward instead of returning to Earth, Alice Lee attempted to send a signal broadcasting a declaration of neutrality to their unknown assailant. Alice Lee stated that they wished to be treated as a separate species that was not party to baseline human conflicts or their allegiance to the Traveler. She prayed that this would be enough to make a difference against such an indifferent darkness. It was at this moment that two members of the crew were out on the hull. One of them had followed the other out. The first of them, Mara, had gone out there to die alone. She had kicked off the hull with 50 kilometers worth of tether, and her brother, Aldwin, had followed her out into the darkness. As the message requesting the massive entity's indifference was broadcast by the captain, the darkness around them abated, and Mara saw a pinprick of light. It was at this moment that Mara found herself and all the occupants of the crew of the ship behind her threatened to be crushed between the mighty presence of light that had just arrived and the terrible darkness that swarmed the area. The colossal forces of light and dark that clashed here smashed into one another yet again, filling the space with so much power and energy that the universe itself struggled to maintain what bounds of law that it could. This was a battleground that was being decimated by the powers of two paracausal entities. It was like dividing by zero or counting infinity. And as the two violent entities finally reached an equilibrium, the real effect of the power began to manifest. The universe created a singularity, a gaping black hole, as an effort was made to cease the paracausal forces that were tearing the very seams of reality apart. The forces of the universe swirled and buffeted around Mara, and it was at this moment that the mistakes of the universe were to be swallowed inside the singularity. Everything pulled forth, and darkness and light continued to fight. And at this moment, Mara made a choice that would change the universe. She detached herself from the 50 kilometers of tether that joined her and the ship, and together, all were pulled down into the singularity. All of them had the same fate, to be swallowed by this black hole. But Mara knew what she wanted. Mara knew her fate. She reached out at the edge of death and knew that she would be the first. But it was not death and sweet silence that found her. Instead, it was new life and a place of miracles. The Awoken records next speak of Captain Alice Lee experiencing a primordial divinity of sorts. As her existence increased in complexity, she developed a small sense of purpose that grew and blossomed until she willed into existence the world that she wished to have found for her people, and in doing so, willed herself into that world as a being not of divine presence, but still of an immortal one. Then she fell to this earth and lived upon it. She believed herself to be the first among the new peoples, and perhaps the only one. But then, lying on a black stone, somewhere near a crashed remnant of the ship, she discovered Mara. As Mara woke, she realized where they were, in a world of incredible bounty within the folded fabric of hidden space-time. They were inside the black hole. Alice Lee inquired why it was Mara that happened to be second. Mara stated that she didn't know. The first lie to be told upon this new world. But Alice Lee believed her, and so they went on to rouse their new people into this new world. And so it was that the crew was roused, and out of the original 40,900 crew members of Yang Lewei, 40,891 awoke, with 9 being unaccounted for. A council was called, and it led the new people to declare certain principles and verdicts. They called themselves the Awoken, and they were immortal. They called their new world within the singularity the Distributory, and they believed that they should never return from where they had been. They created a group of specialists called UTECs to care for the technology of the ship from which they had emerged, and decreed that under careful supervision they would reproduce with wombs of flesh and machine, given that any they added to their number would be immortal too. The population of the new Awoken people was greatly imbalanced, with 3 times more women than there were men, and as a result, until more men were born, they were placed under the protection of the women. Above all, some of the most important verdicts created at this council were the 6th, 7th, and 8th, stating respectively that the Awoken should know and love the cosmos, that the Awoken were created from a covenant of light and dark, but that the covenant was complete and no further debt should be paid, and finally, that the Awoken were whole in themselves, existing in balance. It was also at this meeting that a final 9th verdict was declared, which was that unanimously the people would recognize Alice Lee as their queen. And so the Awoken went out and explored their new world, charting its seas, forests, and stars. This was a great time of creation and pioneering for the new people, And whilst Alice Lee declared as her first rule that there would be no secrets amongst the Awoken, even here, in this place of new paradise and prosperity, conflict would brew. The Awoken spread across the face of the distributory and took on as many diverse lifestyles as one could imagine, from intrepid hunters to great seafarers to sage scholars. But amongst those people, differences of opinion would dwell, and some would come to doubt their purpose on this world. Some dwelt within the cities and preached the doctrine that revered the seventh verdict, that the Awoken were made from the completed covenant of light and dark, and that their debt was completely paid. They believed wholeheartedly that their place within the universe carried no responsibilities, and there would be no repercussions for their action. But those who dwelt within the country, as many Awoken did, were of the Ecolist belief, who did not believe in the seventh verdict, and saw that the clash of titanic forces that birthed them was still going on. They believed that they owed a cosmic debt, one that would eventually need to be repaid. These two ideologies could not be so easily brought into balance. The Ecolists and their opposing sanguine believers were divided, but then a spark ignited a flame. An Ecolist known as the Diacerm walked into the cities and loudly accused Queen Alice Lee of deicide, the murder of gods.
Ooh,
when questioned about this claim, she stated that when Alice Lee had created the world, she could have conceived of it to create the Awoken as gods, so that they might be free from all forms of suffering and pain. Immortality was one thing, but to be truly powerful, and yet to be denied this? Deicide was an appropriate term, perhaps. If this was true,
strange.
This represented an original sin, and what's more, it represented a secret that Alice had kept, even as she had declared that the Awoken were not to keep secrets. The division between those that believed they owed a debt to the cosmos and those that did not ultimately led to a conflict between the Awoken peoples known as the Theodicy Wars. And whilst the nature of the conflict, at least in the Mara Sena, is indicated to be of a smaller nature, nonetheless, people died, and the balance between the two sides had to be struck and a truce negotiated. Alice Lee petitioned Mara Sov, who had been part of the Ecolist camp, to find her mother, who was a skilled negotiator and could broker the peace. The mother of Mara and Aldwin, who had been returned to life as Aldrin, saw through Mara's games, however, and saw part of the truth, which was that Mara, not the Diacerm, was the source of the Ecolist movement. The Diacerm was merely a pawn. This was part of the truth, but not the whole truth, a truth that was known only to Mara for a great deal of time. The monarchy of the Awoken would in time wane in power, and a new group of scholars would come to be the most influential body of rulers. They were known as the Jensum scribes, some of whom still persist in the warlock orders of today. The scribes, who would routinely send Jensum knights on missions to test the reality that they had been studying, knew that Mara and Aldrin were gathering lore and prophecies pointing towards the potential day when the Ecolists would be proven correct, and when the Awoken would need to repay their debt. The Jensum scribes knew that this could cause another Theodicy war, and so when a tall, strong warrior named Sieur Ido walked into the court of the scribes and demanded the knowledge necessary to hunt and kill Mara for her supposed murder of the Diacerm, the Jensum scribes obliged, and gave Sieur the knowledge she would need to hunt down Mara. However, a second Awoken queen was rising to prominence in the Awoken monarchy. Ngoya Pin received a cloaked and masked woman in her court one day, whispered by some to be Mara and others to be the Diacerm. Whatever the case, it mattered not, for after a long time of having the cloaked figure reside within her court, the monarch declared herself a true Ecolist. She bound the ambition and knowledge of the Gensum scribes to the Echolist's preferred task, and so the scribes set about on the course of attempting to understand if the Awoken owed the cosmos a debt or not. The royal palace was turned into a center of learning and a feast of ideas that radically advanced the Echolist cause. Into this feast strode Sieur Ido, her cloak and longbow at her side. She was looking for the hooded figure. She believed that hooded figure to be Mara, and so she followed her to a laboratory, deducing that this would now be the time to draw her weapon. However, as she was about to kill Mara, she saw her face and was bewitched by her beauty and her grace. And this quelled Sieur's desire to see vengeance for the Diasome that she believed Mara had defeated and killed. She threw the weapon between them and told Mara that she could not bring herself to kill, but that the debt of her battle needed to be paid. She would fight Mara to the agony or die trying. And so, Mara called upon Aldrin, her brother, who would battle upon her behalf. Aldrin suggested not one but 3 duels, with blade, rifle, and 5th generation air superiority fighter. These duels and the prospect of Mara's murder troubled the Gensum scribes, as they did not want to appear to have invited murder upon the one who had extensively informed the beliefs of the queen. It would be like killing her priest or her closest confidant. They retreated from the Echolist mission and from the Queen's court, and as the scribes fled the palace in droves, many key contractors in the mission to understand if the Echolists were correct or not sensed hesitation and withdrew their support too. To this, Queen Dingoya Pin denounced the scribes and called them faithless and selfish, which only further deepened the tensions between the Sanguine, who believed that the Covenant was complete, and the Echolists, who were even more doubtful than ever of the 7th verdict. The political tension continued to deepen as Aldrin and Sieur held their duels. The first duel was held with knives and pitted Sieur's simpler, strong jabs against Aldrin's whirling theater of the blade. But they were equally matched, and a draw was called. In the second challenge, the two chose long rifles and hunted each other for days throughout the jungle. Whilst Aldrin blended in and used his stealthy abilities to hide and stake out the fight, Sieur simply let her blunt nature disturb the wildlife around her, which appropriately disrupted and revealed Aldrin. She shot him as he crossed a riverbed, wounding him, but not killing him. For the final challenge, the two chose 5th generation fighters with the full complement of weapons available to either of them. If the full complement could not be supplied, most crucially, it would be simulated instead, and if a simulated kill was attained, it was worth equal value to that of a real kill. Not all weapons were available. In particular, a nuclear payload was not something that the Awoken had kept around, having disposed of those weapons a long time before.
Smart.
Sieur chose an Ermine tactical fighter with a payload of heat-seeking missiles, and Aldrin chose a ship known as a Dart, which was an exceedingly old fighter with terrible onboard systems that would be easily outmatched by the faster Ermine. Sieur might have been able to sense that something was wrong at this point, but regardless, accepted the duel. And 8 miles out from engaging Aldrin in the middle of the sky, Sieur's computer informed her that in a simulated manner, Aldrin had killed her. In fact, he had killed her and everything in a 4-mile radius. Long ago, during an age when the Dart was constructed, the Awoken had used military-grade ship-to-ship nuclear payloads on the Dart. This was still a part of its payload, and Aldrin had simulated firing one of these, and by the result, had ended the duel, and in a simulated manner killed Sieur. After all their fighting, and after all the immense desire for revenge that Sieur held, the two were tied. Sieur threw herself before Mara, informing her that she had fought to a standstill with Aldrin. Sieur left her fate in Mara's hands, and Mara lifted her face, telling her to join them and to be of service to her. And so Sieur did, and from that day forth until her dying day, served at the right hand of Mara Sov. Later, Mara would meet with Ngoya Pin, and Ngoya would inform Mara that she was abdicating the throne. Mara had manipulated the monarchy and the Gensum scribes to ensure that her needs, both scientific and political, had been accomplished, and Ngoya knew this. This was a rebuke as much as one could be made against Mara, but it was already too late. Mara had accomplished her purpose, and was even planning ways to implement the monarch who would supplant Ngoya. After some more time passed, Mara finally put her plan into action. She proposed to the Awoken people and her followers that the hour of their reckoning was at hand, and that the time to repay their debt to the cosmos had come. Thousands flocked to Mara's banner, and an expeditionary force was formed, creating the basis for a journey by the Awoken people into space, back through the black hole, back to where they had come from. The expedition was 12.1 billion years in the making, for time was slower within the black hole. When they would emerge, hopefully not much time would have passed at all. Mara had been preparing for this moment ever since she had been reborn. Before she departed, there were two things she had to do. The first was to ask for a boon from the first queen, Alice Lee, and the second was to say goodbye to her mother one last time. The mother who would not be joining Mara on the voyage back to Sol. In spite of all her power and all her plans and all her manipulations, Mara could not bring her mother with her. She could not convince her to change her ways. Her mother was happy and did not wish to change her life. And Mara knew no matter how much they argued, she could not be swayed. She tried nonetheless, and their final words were bitter and unresolved. But this was nothing compared to the wrath that Mara would experience at the hands of Alice Lee as they spoke later. When Mara arrived, she endeavored to tell Alice Lee the truth, and for this truth that she would tell, the boon that she would ask of Alice Lee was forgiveness. Alice Lee had long suspected that Mara was behind the Awoken people being so divided, so riven. She believed Mara to be the one who had influenced the Diasome and the Ecolists into creating a society that would always have a discontented few, feeling guilt in their debt to the universe. But she could not possibly imagine the scale and brilliance of Mara's design. Mara told her the terrible truth, that Alice Lee only believed herself to be the first being in existence in the new world of the Distributory. And she only believed herself to be the first because Mara had desired it to be that way. For it was Mara who had been the first to cross the event horizon that led to the Distributory. Mara who had designed the world and all its flaws. Mara who had planted the division in the Awoken people. Mara who had been the devil that had invented suffering and invited it into the Garden of Eden that was the Distributory. All this so that 12.1 billion years later she could enact the plan that she had set into motion, so that she could take the skeptics and the guilty and lead them back through the singularity to help fight the cosmic war that had birthed them, so that their debt to the cosmos could be repaid. It was this, the creation of suffering within a perfect world, the first sin within the Distributory, the manifestation of evil that Mara asked for forgiveness for. Forgiveness was not what she received from Alice Lee.
I wouldn't think so.
Yeah.
It was only fury. It was time for Mara and the expedition to depart at long last. The Awoken were returning to the place of their true birth. Before they left the world of the Distributory, there was an alert. Retribution of some form had come for them. Missiles from the surface of the Distributory's planet were being launched, and Mara initiated an emergency launch back through the singularity. Despite the slew of missiles damaging some of the ships, the crews made it mostly unharmed. But Mara was unable to send a final message to her mother. And so she would never know any more from the woman that had raised her. But now was not the time for sorrow. Now Mara needed resolve. she returned through the singularity and emerged back in Sol. On the other side, they were greeted by a system in ruin. The collapse had taken its toll, and Sol was mostly unrecognizable. The once mighty domain of humanity was left shattered and lawless, left in squalor, and without hope of salvation or nobility. Whether Mara and the Awoken owed the debt to the cosmos was a subject of debate that one could potentially hold for 12.1 billion years, but the reality before them demanded a response now. Humanity was on its last legs, and undoubtedly the Awoken could help. Initially, they settled within the asteroid belt, around a massive string of ships, broken but tethered together near Vesta. This was a closeness that originally had kept them alive, and in the end, this was something that would serve the new life of the Awoken. This would now be their new domain, the Reef. As they settled, Keldawaj and the other Uteks who accompanied them, now known as Tekkens, divined that some kind of magic had followed them through, and that the Awoken were giving off a strange series of effects, best described as magic. They defied the powers of the universe. Mathematics, gravity, just in the same way that darkness and light did, but tied to neither. Some Awoken were capable of this acausal effect and others were not. But the effect was strongest around Mara. The Awoken would then also endure a series of attacks by the Elixni, who had succeeded in following the Traveler from their system of origin all the way to its final resting place in Sol. The Awoken fought them back when they attacked. Mara and Aldrin and Zure led the charge every time. Zure's might, Aldrin's speed, and Mara's raw power delivered the Awoken to victory. It was around this time, however, that Mara would also be petitioned by the Awoken for the right to leave the fleet of ships in the Reef and to immediately aid the remnants of humanity. Mara's plan involved them building up a base of power in secret so they could better understand the system before them. The Awoken who wished to leave immediately, however, grew tired of this, and after one craft made a break for it, Mara's own wish was that the Awoken should be given a choice. In all fairness, she had no other options. Mara stated that they were given one chance, and that if they chose to leave, they would not be permitted to return. And so the once riven Awoken were riven again, and those that departed for the worlds of humanity would be of great assistance, but they would no longer be known as the Reef-born Awoken. They would be known as the Earth-born Awoken. Thus, a great people was sundered twice. The Earthborn Awoken that went out into the system were greeted by horrors present to the collapse and the following age of darkness that came with it. They would help to rebuild, but there was no longer a system in which they could see humanity flourishing immediately. The Golden Age was gone, and when the Awoken had returned, humanity had spun into a new age of existence, a dark age, when all but the faintest of hopes had been snuffed out.
Okay, so I found that very fascinating. I mean, as soon as like the guy showed the story of the Awoken is when I felt like I really got hooked in, and with Queen Mara, exceptionally fascinating. And it was cool learning more about her brother as well, whose name I didn't commit to memory because, you know, he's a weenie. But I'm very curious to hear your thoughts because I feel like we're going to differ on this, but I want to hear your thoughts.
I 100% agree with you. I think Queen Mara is fascinating.
Yeah.
A really complicated and interesting character. I don't know that I like her, but I am fascinated by her. She's kind of one of those historical figures, like a famous historical figure that you want to know more about, not because you agree necessarily with what they did, but because they are so kind of memorialized in the pages of history books that you want to know more. I mean, I don't know why this one is coming to mind, because I really don't know much about this, but Genghis Khan is coming to mind. Like, we all know about Genghis Khan in some capacity. We might not know a lot, but like that name is so familiar to us. Not because he was necessarily a great guy. He wasn't. But there is something about him and his achievements, for better or ill, that are so fascinating that you just kind of want to learn more about how could this person do what they did and accomplish what they accomplished. And I'm not saying accomplishment as like a good thing or like validating what they did. I'm just simply saying that like they had objectives that they did achieve. And that's kind of how I'm looking at Mara now in this instance. It's not that I like her or agree with her, but I am fascinated by her. And
I ended up liking her because like at first I was like, and I liked her when we first saw her and I didn't like her brother. But then when they got into this one, I started to think, oh wow, like she's super manipulative. And like she like created all this like discord and she's like gonna take the throne by, I don't know, backstabbing and manipulation and all this stuff. But then when they revealed, when she asked for forgiveness because she did, you know, create the first lie, created the discord so that like she could divide the people. It was like so smart because like in order to get people to really like follow you 100%, there has to be some sort of deep belief that has been grown for centuries and billions of years. Like it's, you know, passed on through generation. And that's just something like they have to believe in more than you, basically. And like to sort of have that foresight is just kind of brilliant. And the fact that she's like, I'm not going to get everybody, but if I can get enough people, then I can go back and help. She wanted to save the cosmos. She didn't want to just stay in their little pocket of like this perfect utopia and just live there forever and be okay with like the rest of the universe burning. And she went back out there and she went to go, you know, help. And so, and like, you know, other Awoken obviously wanted to do that too. And they thought she wasn't taking, you know, she's taking her sweet ass time. So they left her to try to help. I just love the whole story. There were so many, it was complex. There were so many like different viewpoints. And I thought that we would differ on there. I'm like, I don't think you're gonna like her because of how like backstabbing and manipulative that she was. But, you know, do the ends justify the means is good. So I love this.
I think to me, Mara is a brilliant politician.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that says it perfectly because I don't necessarily like politicians.
True.
I think there is something noble about going into public service. I think wanting to go in to better the lives of people is wonderful.
Yeah.
I think politicians often don't actually go into it with those goals, or even if they do, those goals get corrupted and turned on their head very quickly, which is the unfortunate state of politics. And that's not specific necessarily to the US. That might be all across the globe. I just happen to know about the US more than any other country. Mara is a perfect politician. She has the self-awareness to know what she's good at, what her assets are, and work with them, being that her assets are her intellect, her mind, her ability to manipulate, to read people. And she uses everything at her disposal to get to what her ultimate goals are. For that reason, I find her incredibly respectable. Doesn't mean likable. There is a difference. There is a very big difference between respectable and likable. I can respect somebody whose opinions, political views, religious views I differ with, but I can respect their point of view. I don't have to like them, but I can respect them.
Yeah.
So those two are very different. Mara to me is brilliant and worthy of respect. I'm not saying I dislike her because her ultimate goals do seem to be, from this video, good, altruistic, for the betterment. At the same time, this could be a great propaganda video for Mara. So there's that point in me that's like, the jury is out. The jury is out on likable, but I can say that she is respectable. She is brilliant. She knows what she is good at. She has self-awareness. And all of those things are worthy of my respect, whether or not I would ultimately be on her side. I think the other thing that kind of goes into it is we tend to romanticize the past. Whether it is 1950s, ancient history, the colonial era. So I think when we talk about, and it was something that you said about Mara, like realizing she couldn't unite the people, so getting as many on board as she can. I think when we look to the past, we tend to think like, oh, like World War II, for example. That was a time that like all factions of the US united and got on board, and we had a common goal and we were gonna go for it, and like, look what we achieved. Yes, the US achieved some impossible goals at that time based on what people thought we could do. And yes, there was a unification and a common goal. Don't mistake that with believing that everybody in the country was on board with this, because they won't. They weren't. We had Nazis back then in the country. We have neo-Nazis in the country now. Like, the country is never wholly unified, even in the best of times. So I think like Mara recognizing, I'm never gonna get 100% of the population on board with this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get what I can get, is smart and practical in a way that when we tend to look at things in the past, we don't look at them that way. We look at like all or nothing, black or white. But it's like, she recognized life is gray. I'm going to get what I can get, and I'm going to go 110% for it. And she did. And again, that's respectable.
Bringing up some good points. One, something I like latched onto is immediately as he said it, something I thought about throughout the entire video afterwards was when he was talked about, this is the history that we know of the Awoken, but it all comes from one source. It comes from one person. And at first I thought, I'm like, well, that's the dickhead brother. That's like, clearly it's going to be from him. But now I think it's from Mara. And if no one else has gone to like the birthplace of the Awoken, they can't go through that black hole and they haven't like visited there, they can't get the other side of the story. So if Mara has told this whole story to people like throughout time that like, you know, this is how the birth of our people happened. You know, I brought us back here to save the universe. And, you know, the reason like, you know, we're not all here is because of, you know, this, that, and the other. And the way he said it too, I'm wondering if like later on we learn more, and like in Destiny 2, maybe we're going to learn some more about this. So I'm very interested to see if that happens. And if we learn about like the true origin.
Just before you move on, I just have to inject, as you say that, all I can think about is the quote from Braveheart, which is, history is written by those who have hanged heroes. And I'm hearing it in the guy's voice and a Scottish accent in my head, but like, that's so true. When you look at the lyrics from Hamilton, like who lives, who dies, who tells you your story, like history is written by the people who live on and look back. If they look back on you with favoritism, great. Your legacy, your history is golden. If they look back on you and you're terrible, like it's very rarely written by a 100% objective point of view where like, here are the actions, decide for yourself. We try, but we're human. Like it's impossible for us to be 100% objective all the time. That's just not, humans have points of view. We have opinions. It's what makes us interesting and wonderful. It's also what kind of makes us dickish. But like, that is, you know, when they talk about getting justice in a courtroom, justice is not blind. Justice is human eyes, and human eyes have prejudices. So like, you're never 100% going to get an objective, blind justice point of view. That's what we strive to. It's not necessarily what we achieve. So
yeah, this brought up a lot. I think it's also interesting the fact that like they divided up in like the cities and the country were divided. Like people like in the city, like had a different viewpoint than people in the city. I mean, than people in the country. And like there was like, no matter what happens, a whole birth of a new people happens. And of course they come up with ideologies. But yeah, I'm looking forward to checking out more from this. And if you are checking out with us on Patreon, then you know, next week we'll have more for you. If you're checking out with us on YouTube, then you know, we'll go on to the next part. Here we go.
You know, you said something too about...
Or I guess not.
You had said something too when you talked about Mara before my part, where you talked about like how she recognized what she could get and kind of divided the people to get what she wanted. And it made me think again of like, you know, I said she was such a brilliant politician, but I hadn't touched on that specifically. Like, great leaders are unifiers, but it does often seem like great politicians are dividers. They divide us into our brackets and then make sure that they can get the biggest percentage of us from the division. But like, and that's kind of what Mara did too.
Yeah.
You know, she was like, okay, I can divide them accordingly, but if I divide them accordingly, I'll get the larger percentage to favor me. And that's what I'm going to do. And that does seem to be a tactic of politicians time and time again. And that's not just modern politics. That's like been going on for forever.
Yeah.
But what always astounds me is that we as people have I think not universally, but more often than not, an inherent capacity for compassion, acceptance, kindness. And if you actually go out and talk to people who have a different perspective than you, more often than not, you're going to walk away from that with like, okay, I don't like everything about you. I don't agree with everything. And I don't necessarily even maybe like you as a person. You're not somebody I want to go grab a beer with, but I can respect your point of view. We had a conversation. We could have civil discourse and maybe come out the smarter for it, whether that's smarter in our own perspectives or smarter in being awakened to other possibilities. There's still that like, you know, there's more that actually unites us than divides us, and we are able to accept more that divides us than you would necessarily believe from the people in power who seek to divide us because that gives them more political gain. So again, Mara's a great politician.
She is.
For better or worse.
At the end of the collapse, and the start of this new dark age of humanity, the world was left in utter chaos. Whilst some small groups had survived in underground bunkers, such as those fortunate enough in the Black Armory, and whilst others had managed to evade destruction in the wilds, most of humanity lay dead at the hands of the terrible power that invaded the system and challenged the Traveler. We were now left shattered and broken, with no clear means of communication with our outer colonies, and with all in-system trade scuttled. Humanity was cut off and helpless. Only on Earth did anyone really face any prospect of survival or salvation. Not only did humanity face the constant pressing troubles of starvation and exposure, but they also now shared their worlds with a series of strange and deadly forces from many other reaches of the universe. The Vex that had once been found on Venus had surfaced on Mars and Mercury as well, and had utterly transformed Mercury from a garden world into one that was now entirely mechanical, with at least a portion of it hollowed out into a giant simulation engine known as the Infinite Forest. Aside from the Vex, a military power known as the Cabal had also sent 5 of its legions to secure Mars, and to set up a base of operations there so they could launch campaigns into the rest of the system. The 5 legions, the Sand Eaters, Dust Giants, Siege Dancers, Blind Legion, and Skyburners, fought ferociously, knowing that they could only return home if they completed their mission here. Whilst on Mars, they also began to contest the Vex for ownership of the world, but the Vex defended in great numbers, defending almost more fiercely than they did at any other place. The Elixni had also followed the Traveler into Sol, and were now known as the Fallen by the facets of humanity that encountered them, and they spread throughout the system from the Jovian moons to Venus to Earth, with several major houses such as the House of Devils and House of Winter laying claims to vast tracts of land within the territories that were once humanity's. Earth's Cosmodrome in particular was a point of great infestation. And finally, arrived the vanguard of Oryx's hive, with the hidden swarm, Blood of Oryx, and Spawn of Crota, all taking root within Luna. They dug deep into our moon and prepared for yet another one of their grand conquests, creating a shadowy, subterranean fortress known as the Hellmouth, in the region formerly known as the Ocean of Storms. This would burrow so deep into the core of the moon that no light could reach its deepest recesses. These alien forces would help to set the world into chaos, and in the Dark Age, almost nobody could consider themselves to be safe from the conflict that had engulfed all the worlds of humanity. It was at this time that the first of the Lightbearers began to rise and stake their claim in the world around them. These earliest Guardians were not truly Guardians. They were tyrants who saw their newfound immortality as a tool to be abused, as well as their light. There was no duty for them, and all they sought to do was to wage war for whatever they could get their hands on. Many of them would acquire valuable weapons and assets throughout the system, and for a time, humanity's only source of hope would instead be a source of tyranny. But that is not to say that all of the risen Lightbearers were conquerors or villains. Amongst their number rose an order of men and women who would be amongst the first to hold to the true duty of the risen, to protect humanity and to serve the light. These would be the warriors of legend who challenged and eventually defeated the warlords of Earth. They were known as Iron Lords, and the first four amongst their number swore on the day of their founding that they would be protectors and guardians of the people of Earth. And so, Radagast, Perun, Yolda, and Saladin represented some of the first true saviors of humanity. However, defending humanity was not an easy task. Much of them had been disconnected and were lost, broken in the terrible calamity that was the collapse. But as we always have, we survived and collected together. Sometimes into small towns, such as those most fabled places of Palmon or Coyote, who planted their flags and endeavored to make a living off of what remained of the system's bounty. But the greatest gathering of all was that of a massive camp of refugees that flocked to beneath the Traveler, to the place of its final titanic battle against the darkness. The camp began as a simple thing, defended by a few risen and huddled for warmth around fires and in furs. In such a fearful place, disillusion brewed quickly into adversity. Rudimentary factions began to rise with differing outlooks on the best way to control and run this would-be camp. These factions grew until eventually risen enforcers backed them on either side, and with them involved, conflict eventually broke out in the form of what would be known as the Faction Wars, with some among the risen, however, seeking to end the violence. It was in this moment that the Fallen attacked the camp. The factions were broken, but the risen who had backed them on either side of the divide all united and collapsed upon the Fallen with terrible power. The Fallen were repelled, and the new factions were left broken. However, this was a lesson, and the Guardians sought to see that this could never happen again, for this was truly the first point at which they could be called Guardians. For after all, had they not simply accomplished their duty to defend humanity against the invaders of the system? From this conflict, a new system of governance was born. It would be impossible to stop the factions from existing, and so the Consensus was created, as well as the Vanguard. The Consensus was a council of both the Vanguard and many represented factions, all of which would be able to submit proposals to the Speaker, a leader of sorts who had arisen with the supposed ability to speak to the Traveler. The Vanguard was something entirely different, though. The Vanguard was a part of the Consensus, but they were a council of 3 Guardians, one from each discipline: Hunter, Titan, and Warlock. With them, the Guardians would be represented, and with them, they would be officially classified. And so at last, laws were passed and enacted, and a government with clear authority in hand was born. With it, the turmoil of the people began to cease, and what was once a small camp of refugees beneath the Traveler began to grow and blossom, first into a settlement, and then into a bastion. The final bastion beneath our broken god. They would call it the Last City. But this lost city would not stand without challenges or foes to make them. The most persistent threat was ever that of the Fallen, with their lightning-fast raiding parties and their unwavering ferocity. Though the offensives would start as small acts of piracy, they would eventually grow into a perpetual siege that would be as defining a characteristic of life within the city as the very air they breathed. The siege in itself, and the very notion of the Fallen continually attacking the city's walls, was nicknamed the 100-Year Siege, for it seemingly never ended. However, to counteract this perpetual threat, the Titans of the city came up with a solution in the form of a series of walls that encompassed the city. As the walls were built, great defensive installations were placed along their length, including 8 towers, of which now none remain. It was the hope that such a great deterrent, bristling with both the light-bringing guardians and the death-bringing emplacements of guns, would be enough to keep the citizens of the lost city safe from the Fallen. However, the problem was not one that could be solved by high walls and terrifying fortifications, for the Fallen were driven not just by anger, but by a desperate faith. Their true prize was not the eradication of the city or its inhabitants, but the reclamation of the Great Machine, or as we know it, the Traveler. The Fallen had been seeking it out across the dark vacuum of space in true desperation, and imagine their jealousy to understand that when they found it, not only had it been destroyed and was in the possession of humans, but that those humans had not only been gifted with their own golden age, as the Elixni had, but also now were filled with the ranks of Guardians, those who could truly use the Great Machine's power. No, such transgressions were intolerable, and this drove the Fallen to the kind of zeal that only madness of the desperate would dare to invite and entertain. It was then that the Fallen of the House of Devils, with its strongholds located predominantly in Europe, Asia Minor, and Old Russia, struck out in a combined attack on the city. This would be one of the first true tests of the city's resolve, as the Devils brought their terrifying soldiers and artillery to bear, truly living up to their name. But the Titans of the city had prepared an answer. It was not some secret weapon aside from their light, it was not some great strategy, it was simply to hold the line. The 4 orders of Titans, including those such as the Firebreak Order and the Pilgrim Guard, held the 6 approaches to the city in a coordinated defense against the invaders. A great attack was made, and as it was repulsed, there was a chance to charge. But the Titans, including those amongst their order thirsty for blood, held to discipline and held the line. The battle was long and fierce. The Fallen outnumbered them to an almost comical extent, but the Guardians had the light on their side, and when fighting together, even when outnumbered and overrun, they were seemingly unstoppable, and the waves of attacking Fallen broke upon them with ease. The Titans that day held back the Fallen on 6 different fronts, and not a single one of those fronts had broken. This would be the first great victory for humanity in the Dark Age, and this would be the first time the city had ever been defended against a truly overwhelming foe. It would be forever remembered as the Battle of the 6 Fronts, and this battle was such a great honor to Titans that it remains represented in their heraldic iconography to this very day, with Titan hexagonal designs calling back to this and always being divided into 4. But it was not merely Titans that made up the defenses of the city on this day. One of the most prominent sets of heroes that rose also included a warlock by the name of Osiris. The Titan Saint 14 witnessed his incredible skill in battle, seeing that he was almost seemingly in more places than one at any single point in the battle. And it was at this point that Saint 14, who had closely allied himself with the Speaker, recommended that Osiris should be elevated to the Vanguard Warlock position. The relationship of the Speaker and Saint 14 was so close that they referred to each other as father and son, and at Saint's recommendation the Speaker obliged, and Osiris was proclaimed the new Warlock Vanguard. The only dissenting voice of this decision was that of Lysander and the Concordat, A faction that believed Osiris to be a mistake, a misincarnation or a faulty resurrection by a ghost. The victory at Six Fronts marked not only the end of the first great test for humanity, but also marked the beginning of a new age, where hope blossomed once again in earnest. This would be the end of humanity's dark age, where before they had cowered in huddled masses beneath the Traveler and prayed for deliverance. With the Iron Lords, with the Guardians, with the city, that deliverance had come. Now was the time for humanity to stand once more and to begin to fight back. This was to many amongst the number of the Guardians the birth of what would be known as the City Age.
Okay, I like how, so in this world where they have like all this great technology and like the guy had like, you know, basically like Thor's hammer in his like suit that he could power up with all the electricity. Their great defense was a wall. What sort of thing we could come up with to keep people out of here? We'll build a wall. I know.
And even then, for it to be a wall that doesn't work, even though they had like these ferocious fortresses and this great wall, and you know, as has happened time and time again, walls come down.
Yeah.
They just don't. You know, they are a temporary Band-Aid for a much larger problem. I love the fact that in this new age with all of this technology and everything, human nature is human nature. And like, you know, it just kind of devolved into factions that fight. And then the fact that that in and of itself led to the downfall of some because it was the ones who stood together who actually had the fighting chance. God, won't it be great when we as humans learn that lesson? That like we are so strong together. We have such a capacity for amazing things when we work together.
Yep.
But when we devolve into like tribalism and us versus them, we're so weak. That was something that came like, I don't know if it was just sort of like the current state of mind that I'm in, but I just like heard the words like united and together kind of like pop out in this video time and time again, where I was like, that is such a lesson for humans that, knock on wood, maybe one day we'll get. I also loved the fact that, you know, everything seemed hopeless until it wasn't. Like everything seemed lost until a few people were able to stand, and then more were able to stand, and then humanity had a fighting chance. I think that's also a really positive lesson that, you know, there are rough times always, but when we work together and when a few people take that chance to not buy into the hopelessness and to like make the effort, boom, stuff can start actually getting done.
And it also makes me think of, so I liked how they had the fact that some of the Guardians, like when they started out and they were given this purpose to like save humanity, they thought to save it as like rule with an iron fist, and we're going to have all this power. So, you know, we'll protect you, sure, but you know, you gotta live under our thumb. And I think that is very like much like, you know, like very believable that something like that would happen, that people would use power and abuse it. And so I like that was added in there, but then, you know, that the true Guardians of Light overcame those people and overcame those tyrants and rose up against them. So that was a good story, as opposed to like all these people were chosen just because like they could have the light, and it's like for some reason, you know, it made it seem like a little bit more unattainable. Like there's something like so pure about them that they have to have this light, but it's like, no, it's not necessarily the case. They're not necessarily like, you know, better people because they are given this opportunity to hold the light and to be champions of the light. Doesn't mean that they're better people for it. Cause you know, a lot of them weren't. So I like that.
I also think that's something that's not only a reflection of human nature, but also there was some, and I can't remember what TV show movie this was from, but the guy has like 3 wishes and he wishes for world peace, and it eliminates all the people.
X-Files.
X-Files. That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
X-Files, because like the people are the problem. And I think when somebody gets kind of like elevated into this position of power, there is this inherent assumption that goes with that they are somehow better than the rest of us.
Yeah.
And when the person who that is assumed of starts buying into it, the fact that they rule with an iron fist, thinking like, oh, well, this is the only way to like keep the best of our society in line and to like clamp down on the worst of us. But that in and of itself makes people devolve into their worst instincts because it's ruling through fear and an iron fist.
Yeah.
So I just found that interesting. I also found it interesting how much the Fallen are just, I mean, certainly in this came across as just such desperate, fanatical, religious zealot types who are like, I just tunnel visioned to this one outcome based on the hope that the traveler is going to be that thing that they need to thrive. And I don't know, it just struck me as being so short-sighted in a lot of ways. And just, I love how he harped on like their desperation. Because I think that's true when you're looking for an answer sort of like outside yourself. Like everything in my life will be fixed if. And that if is like, if I win the lottery, if this person loves me back, if I get that job. It's like, yes, I mean, don't get me wrong, like winning the lottery is going to help all of us in a lot of ways, sure. But the answer to happiness in your life doesn't exist out there in any one thing. It exists in here and like fixing what you're not happy with in yourself. So that was just kind of something that came to mind as they kept talking about how fanatically the Fallen were going after this and sort of how desperate they were because everything was wrapped up into acquiring this one thing.
All right, so then the next part will be wrapping up everything. And if you're watching with us on YouTube, then we're just gonna go right into it. And if you're watching with us on Patreon, then you're gonna get that video coming up later this week. So yeah, all right, here we go. Super happy fun times.
The City Age may be named after the city, but one of the most important things to know about the City Age is merely to do with the incomplete nature of humanity's knowledge. At the time being, there were no dates, no timelines, and of course, our idea of what was blurred and partially incomplete. Such is the nature of a post-apocalyptic era, and there is no real consensus therefore on when the City Age truly began. For some, it was at the victory at Six Fronts, for others the formation of the walls, and for a few still, it was at the creation of the camp beneath the Traveler. But
that's not really a city.
The City Age began, and it played hosts to ballads of legends, myth, and incredible adventure. The city would expand and grow into a powerful bastion of humanity, and the Guardian Orders would press out into the solar system and commit to brave deeds of heroism. However, the first event that is noted in the timeline of the City Age that is of real significance is that of a terrifying purge of some of the most majestic and dangerous creatures within the system. It would start with the events known by the Guardian Orders as the Great Hunt. But in order to better understand the Great Hunt, you need to start in the Reef, not the city. Back in the Dark Age, when the Awoken had just been split into the Earth and Reefborn, Mara instructed Aldrin to go out into the system and to discover for her a unique source of power. Aldrin returned with what is known as a wish dragon, an Ahamkara. Ahamkara are dragons, both sentient and intelligent enough to speak, bargain, and deceive. But this was not the only thing that made the Ahamkara extraordinary. Ahamkara were shapeshifters, capable of growing massive or minuscule in size on a whim, and also had access to a special kind of magic, known as wish magic. This power, as best we know, holds no allegiance to the light or dark, but it manipulates the threads of fate and the fabric of the universe in a similar manner to the power of the light and the dark. It was not some stupendous power capable of crushing atoms, but instead it was a subtle thing that could manipulate the universe without necessarily invoking its physics. Wish magic was named such because it relied on preying on the ambitions and desires of those not strong-willed enough to contest the Ahamkara. The Queen and the dragon Aldrin recovered eventually forged a bond, and the young Ahamkara would come to name itself Riven, in honor of the twice Riven people that was the Awoken. More Ahamkara flocked to the reef, and Awoken society began to revolve around them. It is here that wish magic and the incredible designs of the Awoken came together to create what is known as the Dreaming City, a sacred place to the Awoken, hidden within the stars of the reef itself. In this place, the Ahamkara and the Awoken lived in relative harmony. All seemed peaceful, but the Awoken Queen knew that the Ahamkara could be found all over the system, and that the unique power she had sought was not in fact so unique. But this was not to be forever. She would soon have that unique source of power. It was at this time that the city also began to encounter the dragons, and at which point they realized the danger that they posed. The bargains struck with the Ahamkara had granted the Guardians great power and wisdom and information that was crucial to their campaigns, but had also always come at a terrible cost. This was the nature of wish magic. For every wish granted, there was a terrible, twisted reality to it, one that would always come at the cost of the Guardian themselves or someone around them. With their presence becoming a threat to the safety of the city itself, it was decreed by the consensus that the beasts should be hunted down and made extinct. And so the Great Hunt began.
Or you could just not wish anymore.
Quietly petitioning the Awoken monarchy for aid. This aid was granted to them in the forms of weapons to hunt the beasts, although this aid was even secretly made available at the request of Riven. Perhaps Riven was fulfilling Mara's wish for some source of power that the wishes always grant the Ahamkara, or perhaps for some unique advantage. But regardless, many great warriors took up the weapons of the Awoken and the city, and took part in the hunt, or at least the process of it. Many terrible final wishes were made by the beasts and their assailants. Some of the scars of those wishes can still be seen today. Though, as with all things to do with wish magic, there are many details that are unclear, or as of yet, unproven. Regardless, the Ahamkara were hunted to the very brink of extinction, with only Riven surviving, trapped within the fortified citadel at the heart of the Dreaming City, in a place known as the Queen's Walk. With that, the only way the Ahamkara could communicate to us was through their remains, which held some of their latent power. But for the most part, it would be generations, even hundreds of years, before the Guardians saw another Ahamkara ever again. However, it was not just the Ahamkara that would start to see their end in this time. The days of the Iron Lords were also numbered. They had continued to exist and to defend the city as they grew in number, sending out guardians from their base of operations on Fellwinter Peak. The Order had grown to at least 100 in number, but Radagast lamented that whilst he and his Iron Lords could defend humanity and watch over the vast tracts of Earth, they could not so easily return humanity to its golden age of technology. But when Lord Timur, a warlock of the Iron Lords, discovered records of the lost Golden Age technology of Siva, Radagast leapt into action. The nanotechnology could potentially rebuild the marvels that humanity had lost, and with it at their command, there was the potential for them to do even more incredible things. When the location of the technology's whereabouts had been discovered, particularly the replication complex in the northeastern section of the Cosmodrome, every one of the Iron Lords descended on that part of the world in force, hell-bent on claiming the technology for humanity. It was discovered that the billions upon billions of Siva nanites were still under the command of a fragment of the Warmind Rasputin, and in a moment that would resound throughout the ages, the infamous Iron Lord warlock known as Fellwinter attempted to commune with the shard of Rasputin. However, for reasons not truly understood, the Warmind sent its response in the form of a 3-word command to the millions of nanites of Siva. This command would spell doom for the Iron Lords that laid claim to this ancient technology. Those words? replicate, eliminate, immunize. And so full of fury that only a weapon such as Siva could contain, Siva's nanites were unleashed upon the Iron Lords. The battle was one of terrible proportions, and it was suddenly clear that if Siva was not contained, it was liable to overrun the Cosmodrome, and from there, who knows what it could do. 9 Iron Lords made a push for the replication complex, where the source of the Siva nanites could be found. But after much fierce fighting, it was clear that all hope was lost without great sacrifice. Lady Yolda took it upon herself to seal the replication complex with 7 other Iron Lords and herself inside, whilst also detonating an explosive device that contained the outbreak of Siva. The only Iron Lord to survive the replication complex was Lord Saladin, and the battle outside in the Cosmodrome had seen all the other Iron Lords slaughtered, with the exception of Lady Ephrodite, who went on a path of exile and pacifism from that day onward. The area of the Cosmodrome containing Siva was, from this point onwards, quarantined, and from that day forth the region would now be known as the Plague Lands, for the mechanical plague that lay dormant beneath its surface. Lord Saladin would wait and watch, holding silent vigil over the place, until the day that he might finally be needed again, to finally bring rest to those Iron Lords that had been lost. Meanwhile, back in the city, trouble was starting to brew. Osiris, the new Warlock Vanguard, was descending into a deep and secluded study of the Vex. He knew that other threats to the city, such as the Fallen, did exist, but his research had left him convinced that the Vex represented the greatest present danger to the forces of the city and to the Guardian Orders. These beliefs brought him into contention with the rest of the consensus, and in particular, the Speaker. When Osiris sought to publish his findings in order to arm the people of the city with knowledge, the people instead took to them not as scientific study or fact, or even merely as speculation by a scholar. Instead, they took to them as prophecy. Such was the cult of Osiris's personality. The Speaker then saw this as an attempt to radicalize and split the population of the city between those that supported Osiris and those that supported the consensus. The Speaker even took to the extreme measure of burning the prophecies of Osiris, and began to speak of the once revered Warlock as though he was a curse. One day, the Speaker called the consensus to order and declared that Osiris was a tumor to an otherwise healthy body, and called for a motion to exile the Warlock. It was at this moment, however, that Osiris entered the hall of the consensus and accepted the decision wholeheartedly. Osiris left the city and headed out into the territories of the Vex so he could fight them on their own ground. But what Osiris could not take with him was the impact that he'd made upon the city and its people. This was irreversible, and would sow the first seeds of dissent against the Vanguard, the city, and the consensus. Seeds that perhaps can still be felt to this day, seeds that perhaps have dwindled and died, but regardless, Osiris's cult would leave a mark. There was, however, little time for this disunity amongst the people and the guardians of the city. A foe on the horizon that was all too familiar was beginning to raise its ugly head, and all of the forces of the city would need to muster in order to face it. The fallen houses were starting to coordinate and gather their forces. Whilst this would sound innocuous to some, this would be correctly identified by the Hunter Scouts in the employ of the Vanguard as all too terrible an occurrence. The fallen houses were normally fiercely territorial and would fight amongst themselves to maintain the status quo, but for them all to be collaborating meant that they needed to unite under a common cause, and this could only be one thing: the Great Machine. Having seen the House of Devils so firmly rebuked by the city at the Battle of the Six Fronts, it was clear to the Fallen that it would take the forces of more than just a single house to have any chance of breaking the city and claiming the Great Machine for their own. And so the 4 greatest houses in the system came together with a united purpose: to reclaim their heritage lost in the whirlwind by right of war. The House of Devils, Kings, Winter, and Wolves collected their forces and made plans to converge on the city as a united armada that would blot out the stars with their numbers. Millions of fallen were assembled for what was quite possibly the most colossal battle in the history of the city. It was believed that with their combined might, the houses would be unstoppable, and that united under a joint banner they would not only reclaim the great machine, but also destroy their bitter human rivals, once and for all. The battle for the city that would take place that day would be known as the Battle of the Twilight Gap. The city prepared for the attack, and the defense was organized by 3 titans. Lord Saladin led the defenses and was in command of all deployments of the forces of the city. His 2 commanders would be given specific forces and would be able to assist in holding the wall from the front line. The fighting was ferocious, and it appeared as though the Fallen had humanity backed into a corner as the forces of the Devils, Winter, and Kings pushed hard against the Twilight Gap, a small segment of fortifications that was being quickly overrun. Saladin saw this and was dismayed, calling for all forces to fall back to the next district. Lord Shax, who was at the Twilight Gap, saw this and could not abide by such a notion, for he knew that falling back could very well mean the doom of the city. He was left with a choice. He could either obey orders and fall back to the city, or he could hold his ground and defend the Twilight Gap with everything that he had left. In that moment, Shax held the fate of the last safe city and of all of humanity in his hands. And luckily for us, he chose to disobey his orders. He called his fire team, including the fabled gunslinger Anna Bray, the Sunbreaker weapons crafter known as Lui Feng, and 3 other guardians known as Keshi 32, Abdi, and Truce. Together, the 6 of them fought, back to back, side by side, dying over and over, defending the very soil for the hallowed place that it was. For this was the last bastion of hope, and they would defend it until the last of their light was spent. The Firebreak Order would have been proud. They had stood their ground and chosen a place upon which it would be worthy for them to die. But they would not fall. And after enough time had passed, the other defenders were able to reorganize and create a counterattack. The reinforcements included Andal Brask, the Hunter Vanguard, and Commander Zavala, the other sub-commander of the city's forces. Now reunited with their fellow Guardians, they would begin to sweep back the tide of Fallen. And with that, any chance of the Fallen claiming the Traveler was snuffed out for good. Lord Shax, with his decisions in that split second, had saved the last safe city. This represented a landmark moment for the city. Not only was it truly a stellar victory for the forces of the city over the Fallen, but it set into motion a spirit of indomitable confidence within the Guardian Orders. The Fallen had gathered the full measure of their might to contest the city, and in spite of those close odds, the attack had been squarely repelled. Shax, however, would feel repercussions of this day. Him, Zavala, and Saladin would never quite be friends again, thanks to his insubordination on that day. Regardless, Shax would gain a level of prestige that was unparalleled, and would go down in the history of the city as a living legend. But the cost of this victory would also be immense. Many legendary guardians had fallen that day, and the ranks of those that remained were stretched thin. Amongst those supposedly lost was Anna Bray, who had been seen by Zavala falling from the city after being assailed by a fallen captain. The city mourned for the losses, but in a way, it also made the city stronger, as the loss brought a series of actions from the city's citizens and guardians that proved its own resolve. Many attempts were made to honor the heroic guardians that had fallen that day, but the most notorious of these attempts was not some statue commissioned or a bank of flowers left in the tower. Instead, it was the creation of 2 genius inventors known as Faisal Crux and Victor Lomar of the Crux Lomar Foundries. They were responsible for creating much of the city's heavy ordnance, and with this goal of honoring the guardians that had fallen that day in mind, there was a pure intent that they had realized, and they saw to the development of a new weapon through what would be known as Project Palmdale. This would involve the melting down of the armor of those guardians lost at the Battle of Twilight Gap. They would then see that armor reforged into one of the most infamous weapons in the history of humanity, the Yalahorn shoulder-mounted launcher system. Not only did it contain revolutionary technology in the form of the Wolfpack rounds, but it also howled with the fury of the guardians that had fallen that day, fighting back not just with the explosive fire that one would expect, but also with the light of those guardians that had fallen. Others still honored those that had fallen that day with actions that were more direct. Saint 14 was the most notorious amongst them, and took it upon himself to personally conduct the Great Crusades. These were great attacks against the fallen that he undertook alone. These campaigns were incredibly successful, and as time went on, each of the houses were beaten back. Eventually, the Crusades were so successful that Saint 14 found himself dueling with Sulcus, the Kell of the House of Devils. Sulcus eventually held the Titan in a choking grip, and it was almost at the point where Saint was defeated. But the Titan rolled back his shoulders and head, with every ounce of strength remaining, and used it to headbutt the Kell of the fallen House of Devils so hard that the Kell's skull caved in, killing him instantly. Saint 14 stood, alive and victorious. Saint was then contacted by the Speaker, and although the Speaker wished him to return home, having heard news of Osiris being spotted on Mercury, Saint headed out there to find him, and was never seen again. However, what is overlooked by some is that the glorious victory at Twilight Gap would have been impossible without the intervention of another infamous figure within the system, namely the Awoken Queen of the Reef, Mara Sov. She saw the Fallen communicating with each other across the system, and it was the House of Wolves that had disturbed her. Their fleet had gathered from the Jovian moons and was making a resupply run at the asteroid of Ceres, which lay squarely in Awoken territory. The Queen had two possible choices. Either she could allow the Fallen to pass by and keep the reef a secret from the rest of the system, or she could engage the Fallen Wolves at her door and destroy them, whilst exposing the reef to everyone in Sol. A choice between secrecy and publicity, a choice between peace and war, and Mara chose war. What followed was a series of campaigns and skirmishes that involved both the Awoken of the Reef and the various fractious parts of the House of Wolves. It would culminate in a battle between Mara's forces and the newly appointed Wolf-Kell Skolas the Rabbit. The war might have been yet bloodier and might even have been lost, but the Fallen were betrayed by a House of Judgment scribe known as Varix the Loyal. He was in service to Skolas and allowed the Awoken a critical advantage, which let them capture Skolas finally. He was sent to languish in the Prison of Elders, along with many of his truly faithful fallen wolves. But in the Prison of Elders, there was no potential to grow, and so some of the wolves swore loyalty to the Vestian dynasty of Mara Sov. They would eventually, of course, betray her, but for a time, the Fallen and the Awoken lived together in the reef in harmony. Meanwhile, in the ranks of the Guardians, Osiris's teachings would not go without having an impact still. Saint 14 was not the only one who was seemingly obsessed with the old Warlock Master, and having heard of the power of the Vex from his teachings, there were others that sought to fight against this terrible foe. And it was then that three Guardians, known as Praedith, Pahanin, and Kabir the Legionless, would attempt to enter the Vault of Glass and defeat the terrifying Vex presence within. However, they severely underestimated the power of the Vex's defenses within the vault, which, despite seeming like nothing more than a large cave network, was in fact a giant fortress and the site of some of their greatest experiments with time. Within the time streams, they could do more than simply destroy the Guardians with their immense firepower. They could manipulate time as a weapon. The Guardians faced what were known as the Oracles in the Vault, Vex supercomputers capable of isolating an individual within time, and unless they asserted dominance over it, removing them entirely. Understand that this means you don't simply die. To be found wanting by an Oracle, to be stunned by the ritual of negation, is to have never existed at all. Such was the power of the Vex in the Vault. In the face of such power, the Guardians were helpless. The Hunter Pahanin fled, and the Warlock Pradith was locked deep in the confines of the Vault, lost in its time stream. However, it was Kabir the Legionless who would face the most gruesome fate of all. Kabir would drink of the Radioloria of the Vex Oracles, and this meant that his body slowly began to be corrupted as he himself was changed into the Vex. He would lose control over his body and brain, and before they took him entirely, Kabir forged a mighty shield known as the Aegis. It is into this shield that he poured all of his light, so that if other Guardians might come through the Vault, they might have a source of power that could be used to break the Vex's hold over time. The first raid on the Vault of Glass was a failure, and Kabir the Legionless was no more. But this would not be the last adventure that the Guardians would see in the Vault of Glass. Meanwhile, in the city, factional differences within the consensus were beginning to intensify, and Lysander, the leader of the faction known as the Concordat, declared war upon the Vanguard and the Speaker, although his reasons for doing so are not well recorded or understood. This upheaval led to a final confrontation between the new monarchy and the Concordat in the tower that is known as Bannerfall, and this effectively ended their membership of the consensus and their general part in the city's life. In their place, another faction known as the Future War Cult was promoted to the rank of full consensus member. Around this time, the consensus records also make the first real mention of Lord Shaxx and his Crucible, the objective of which was simply to allow Guardians to train by fighting each other. Guardians had long had a habit of fighting and settling differences through combat, but Shaxx's Crucible formalized the practice and acted as a tempering flame to the blade that was the young Guardians entering the ranks that had so recently been filled with heroes. The Crucible over time became more and more engraved in the city's culture, and eventually became a televised sport within the city, with residents placing bets and supporting their favored Guardians or clan-based teams with incredible vigor, just as one might support any other sporting team today. The games led to a sense of honor and chivalry for most, because even as the Guardians fought each other, they made each other stronger in the process. But that strength would still not be enough to stop the most aggressive of adversaries. It had been some time since the attack on Twilight Gap, and the Fallen had not made another assault on the city in some time. However, this was not to say that the Fallen weren't still a menace. Long prior to Twilight Gap, the wilds were haunted by the whispers of a fallen mercenary called Taniks the Scarred, who was a gun for hire amongst the Fallen, one who would pursue Guardian targets in particular at the behest of those who could pay a handsome price. A mercenary through and through, but a devious one with a mean streak and a habit for destroying Guardians entirely. After encountering him in the field, the hunter Andal Brask and his close friend Cade Six made what would be known as the Vanguard Dare. The first one to kill Taniks would be rewarded with renown and fame. The loser would fill the hunter's vanguard position, a most onerous task for a hunter that desires freedom and the ability to explore. Cade went on to win the contest, killing Taniks, But the problem was that Cade had not simply killed a being of mortal flesh. Tanax was more mechanical than biological, and every death would simply mean his reconstruction. In time, Tanax would find vengeance, and sometime after the Fallen had been served their bitter defeat at Twilight Gap, Tanax would serve vengeance by slaughtering Andal Brask. Feeling guilt and a responsibility for not having been able to kill Tanax, Cade took the place of the Hunter Vanguard in Andal's stead. The loss of the Hunter's Vanguard could have been a deterrent to the Consensus and the FOTC generally, but perhaps emboldened by the city's dominant position or believing with hubris that they could reclaim the glory of the Golden Age, they set their sights on a grand military goal. When the first men landed on the moon in the 20th century, they marked themselves as true pioneers of humanity and human civilization. For better or for worse, the Consensus sought to emulate their forebears and sought to reclaim the moon from the Hive. Some would call it brave, the wise would call it madness. Lord Shax, having faced the Hive and the might of their swords before, would inform the Consensus in no uncertain terms of the mistake that they were making, pleading with them to call off the attack after having witnessed their power at another smaller skirmish known as the Battle of the Burning Lake. The Consensus, however, was unmoved, and the Expeditionary Army was approved. The city gathered together the first and last army of Guardians to serve on a mass offensive against the alien force in Sol. Over 1,000 Guardians journeyed to the moon and touched down with the intent to claim it from the Hive by force. However, in spite of the might of over 1,000 Guardians being present on the moon's surface, the banners of the Cormorant Seal would meet stern resistance from the Hive. Whilst gains were made at first, and whilst some prisoners were even captured, the Guardians were stopped by an unbreakable champion of the Hive, a terrible demon wreathed in green flame, wielding a sword that cracked the surface of the moon with every swing. It was here that the Battle of Mare Ibrium would be fiercest, and it was here that the Guardians would first face Crota, the Eater of Hope, the son of Oryx. His counter-assault on the Guardian forces was so vicious and complete that it is better remembered as butchery. The Guardian forces had to pull back, having lost many of their number, and so the Battle of Mare Ibrium ended in crushing defeat. As the beleaguered Guardian forces fled the moon's surface, they left behind many dead, and would forever remember the failed assault on the moon by a terrible different name. They would remember it as the Great Disaster. The aftermath of this calamitous event was far-reaching and tragic, but there is one tragedy that rises to prominence above all the others. The tragedy of Eriana III and Wei Ning. Eriana III was a warlock of the Praxic Order, and at Mare Ibrium she had lost her lover. Wei Ning, a mighty Titan warrior, who at the hands of Crota had been slain. Wishing for revenge, Eriana sought a means by which she could assail the Hive and destroy Crota, but she would not receive any assistance from the city following their terrible defeat, as the Consensus suspended all Cislunar Guardian operations and stated that any to step onto the moon's surface did so alone. Eriana's vengeance would have to be attained another way. She was joined in her struggle by a hunter of the Hidden, a mysterious organization run by Ikora Rey. This hunter was Eris Morn, and she too was hell-bent on avenging those who had fallen to Crota's blades on the surface of the moon. Together, they knew that in order to defeat their enemy, they needed to understand them, and if they expected any success in this matter, they needed to find someone who knew the Hive better than most. And so it was that they sought out the exiled warlock master of Hive Arcana. They sought out Toland, the Shattered One. His exile was originally due to his heretical beliefs and his adoption of the Hive's very own sword logic as his core values. He believed that the darkness would be victorious with this simpler, more effective logic of battle. And with Toland at their side, a team began to form. Eris, Toland, and Eriana were joined by 2 hunters known as Omar-Gar and Saimota, and a mighty titan of the Pilgrim Guard known as Veltalo. Together, the fire team would assemble and assault the Hellmouth and take the fight to the Hive. 6 of them would go down into the pit, seeking revenge for those they'd lost, or seeking power locked deep within the Hive fortress. Veltalo was defeated by a mass of thralls that swarmed over him, and though the thrall were weak individually, as a horde, they tore the Titan limb from limb. Saimota was lost at the hands of Omnigul, the will of Crota, and the mother of his spawn. Eris was the last to see Omar-Gar, who had been captured and broken by the Hive, suffering possibly a worse fate than death, for his light was torn from him like flesh from bone, and was fed to a new generation of Crota's spawn. He died in agony so unimaginable that only in the cruel minds of the Hive could it even be contemplated. Eriana III and Toland made it down into the stills at the very bottom of the Hellmouth, and even made it into Crota's Ascendant realm, the Oversoul throne. It was here, in the apex of Crota's power, that Toland showed his true colors. He conversed with the death singer Yut, and his curiosity to understand her death song was met with a culling. He was stricken from his mortal body by her power, and his soul was loosed into the Ascendant realm, where he would wander the Sea of Screams, much to his delight, much to his interest. Then, it was only Eriana who stood before the power of the Hive Prince. Her death is not recorded, but it is assumed without a doubt that she perished. This left only one, Eris Morn. Eris, who was now deep in the Hellmouth, and who had lost her sight and her ghost. She should have died at the hands of the Hive, and yet, she went on and survived, and stole back her sight, using the eyes of an acolyte as her own, and for hundreds of years she dwelled in the depths of the Hellmouth. With the loss at Mara Ibrium and the failure of the first fire team to defeat Crota's forces, the city descended once again into an age where darkness seemed very palpable and very terrifying. The forces of the enemy pressed in around us, and the once great power that had radiated from the Guardians had started to wane. The city held its breath as the last tower stood in defiance against the night. Tales once told to frighten children slowly stopped, as the children were frightened anyway. And in the hour of great darkness that had descended upon us, something glimmered. It was not something that the city was unused to, but it was something that it had forgotten. Hope. Hope would find us. And that hope was you.
All right, well, I don't think that was as happy as you thought it was going to be.
No, but like, what awesome names. Crota, the Destroyer of Hope, and the Sea of Screams, and like, bravo. Way to dole out the drama.
And now I feel bad about giving Eris such a tough time during our cutscene reaction for her when we took on Crota, and like, you know, her just going on and on again about like 6 went down and only I came out. Like, if she had to, like, you know, take someone's eyes and stick it in her own to see, and like had to like live down there for, I can't remember how long they said that she had to live down there for, but it was quite a while living there on her own before she was finally able to sneak out. You know, so that's impressive, especially without a ghost.
Yeah, definitely. I also gotta say, I really like Ariana. I just, that revenge journey thing just appeals. So would love to know more about her. Like, I think you could probably do a whole thing just unto her and her whole journey, because she sounds like a badass.
And also, I like the name Anna Golden sounds familiar. I don't know if we met her before or like I've heard about her. And she is like they said she died, or it was like presumed that she was dead though, because like in one of the little comic strips that they showed, it was worded in a way that like her death was only believed. Like this is believed to be like how, you know, she had died, and it wasn't said like, you know, for sure that she was dead. So that I stuck a pin in that. I'm like that, is she gonna come back maybe?
You watch enough movies lately and it's like, unless you see them die in front of you, there's reason to believe they could come back.
Yeah, for sure. Not enough dragons though. I mean, the dragons got taken out already. And so Mara was smart to like, you know, to befriend them. And like, I like how, you know, these wishes always come with a price and it ends up being bad. So we gotta kill these dragons. Like, why don't you just, you know, leave the dragons alone and stop making wishes with them.
I think this just proved that we as humans don't deserve dragons.
There you go.
Because that was what I walked away with.
That is the moral of destiny.
It was really sad to see the dragons with like the spear sticking out of them and everything. I just very much did not like that. But to move away from dead dragons. What I do like that this ended on is it did end on a hopeful note. And I think that is something incredibly special to the human condition, is that we have the unique ability to hold on to hope, even in some of the darkest days that we as humanity have faced. And I think that's pretty magical for people. So I liked that it ended on hope.
Yeah, that's nice. I think my favorite part overall from the whole journey that we've watched for this little intro lore for Destiny was the birth of the Awoken, like Mara's story. I found that the most interesting, and like that was like hooked me the most out of all these stories. What about you?
Yes, that, and then I think also, like I said, Ariana was just something that I walked away. I mean, it wasn't huge per se, but it was definitely something that like just hooked me as wanting to know more. And
props to the one-horned guy. I forgot his name, but for standing up to Saladin, Lord Salad, and, you know, just, yeah, I mean, you know, it's because, like, the guy's probably got a lot of prestige and everything, and it's kind of hard to say no. Like, he was no longer trusted after that, which I get, but he had to do what he thought was right, and, you know, and they wouldn't listen to him again, even though he proved the first time that he was right, and they're like, he's like, don't do this, don't go in there, and they went in there anyways, and then they lost a bunch of people. So he had a good strategy, and like, you know, he's the guy I want on my side, like leading my armies.
Yeah, I agree. You definitely want him on your side. You don't want to be going against him.
No, for sure.
Even though nobody who's with him believes him. So I don't know, maybe that is an argument for being on the opposite side.
He had some people with him. He had a crew. They were back to back and side by side together, sticking it out. So
he had like his band of misfits.
Yeah.
Just like Star-Lord.
Exactly. And Young Guns and a whole bunch of other stuff with Band of Misfits that just stick together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let us know what you thought about this down below in the comments. And yeah, so if you want us to go on to the next part of My Name is Bife's video where it goes over Destiny 1, we were thinking about going into just diving into Destiny 2, doing those cutscenes since we've already done Destiny 1. I don't feel like we need a refresher, but I mean, we could dive into it more. Doesn't mean we'll never come back to it. I just feel like, you know, now it's time to go on to Destiny 2. That's this. That is my, you know, the steps.
Yeah, the steps.
If you want all our Destiny reactions, go ahead and check out the description of this video. We got a playlist there for you. Thanks so much for checking out our reaction for Destiny, Complete Journey by My Name is Bife, but just keep in mind
that our reaction is definitely not definitive.